Good evening. Welcome to tonight's debate, where our speakers will consider the proposition, God does not exist. Dr. Singham on my right will affirm the proposition that God does not exist, while Mr. Puckett on my left will deny that God does not exist, or for those of you that are English majors, will remove the double negative and say he'll affirm that God does exist, just to make it simple. So the format for the debate tonight will consist of a set of opening arguments where each speaker will construct his arguments for 20 minutes, for a total of 20 minutes with the two. And Mano will go first. That will be followed by a period of rebuttals. Each speaker will rebut the other's arguments for 15 minutes each, for a total of 30 minutes. Mano will also go first in that section. The final arguments will follow that, where each speaker will conclude his arguments in 5 minutes each, for a total of 10, and Joe will start that section with Mano concluding. I will be keeping the speaker's time, and I'll be charitable up to the first 30 seconds after the allowable time. Anything longer or in the beginning of a new train of thought will result in my calling time, and they're going to sit down. We'll see. After the debate is concluded, we're going to have a 15-minute intermission followed by a question and answer session. During the intermission, feel free to stretch your legs, do whatever. You may also write a question during the intermission, as we'll accept questions for the Q&A session, both orally and in writing. We'll have microphones down here at the front, so if you want to ask your question orally, or you can write out the question. Either way, please address it. If you write your question, please make sure it's addressed to one of the speakers. And each speaker will address their question with 2 minutes, and then the other speaker will have an opportunity to rebut or address the same question in a minute. Okay? Just logistically, if you need restrooms, out the back doors, left down the hall or right down the hall, either one works. If you have children that you would like to take out at any time, if you go right down the hall, there's a nursery down there that's attended if you'd like to come back. You can also hear the microphone proceedings here in this room. Then, once we complete the Q&A session, each of the speakers will conclude with closing remarks of 5 minutes each, with Mano going first. So that's what's going to happen. I would like to ask you, as the moderator, to refrain from responding to the speaker's arguments during their speaking times. Neither heckling, nor cheering, nor applause, etc., please. You might ask why. This kind of debate is not about just supporting our own point of view and being happy when we think the speaker that holds our point of view scores points. That's not the point of this. We're here to learn. We're here to learn about each other's positions, to understand the arguments for both perspectives here, and then to challenge why we believe what we believe and come to a better resolution for ourselves. So again, I ask you to be polite. Applause at the end of each section is fine. No problem there. But please, during the discussion, let the speakers make their points. And I appreciate that. All right, with that, I'll introduce our speakers and then we'll get started. Dr. Mano Singham holds a PhD in physics and is the adjunct professor in theoretical physics and is the current director of the University Center for Innovation in Teaching and Education at Case Western Reserve University. He's the author of 3 books: God versus Darwin, The War Between Evolution and Creationism in the Classroom. The second one is The Achievement Gap in U.S. Education, Canaries in the Mind. And the third, Quest for Truth, Scientific Progress and Religious Beliefs. Mano maintains a professional blog dealing with science, history, and philosophy of science, religion, politics, the media, education, learning, books, and film. Dr. Singham will be the affirmative speaker. Joe Puckett Jr. is a Christian philosopher, preaching minister for the Hartville Church of Christ. He holds a Master of Arts in Humanities, focusing in philosophy and religion from Faulkner University's Great Oaks Honors College. He's currently working on his PhD in Humanities with a focus in philosophy and plans to complete that study in 2015. Joe is the author of The Apologetics of Joy, A Case for the Existence of God, from C.S. Lewis's Argument from Desire. Joe has a special interest in the philosophy of mind, moral theory, and religious epistemology, which is the study of origin, nature, and limits of human knowledge, and has presented academic papers on C.S. Lewis and Eastern philosophy at Faulkner University's Journal of Faith and the Academy. Our speakers. With that, I'll set the time, and Mano will begin.
Thanks, Alan. And I'd like to thank the Northwest Church of Christ. By the way, can everybody hear me at the back? Good. Northwest Church of Christ for kindly agreeing to host this event, this lovely building, and to Joe for initiating this debate, and to Mark Duboski of the Cleveland Freethinkers groups, for both of them for putting this event together. Now, everyone has heard the old saying that you cannot prove a negative. So when Joe offered me the choice of several topics for this debate, why would I pick God does not exist, which is a negative, to argue in the affirmative? It would seem like I lose straight off the bat. But nothing really hinges on the outcome of this debate. If Joe wins, however we measure that, his God isn't suddenly going to appear and pat him on the back for saving him from an eternity of non-existence, and maybe even give him a halo. It's not going to happen. If I win, well, nothing will happen really, because the world we live in is pretty much consistent with there being no God. So I picked this proposition to affirm because it would enable me to make certain important points about the nature of scientific logic and scientific proof that enables us every day to confidently assert that some things, including God, do not exist, even though they are not logically excluded. I want to first make clear that when I use the term scientific logic, I am referring to the means by which we gain knowledge that is not accessible via the usual five senses, our immediate five senses. This logic is used by all the disciplines that share an investigative framework that generates true, reliable knowledge. It has been identified with science, but is not limited to it. The use of this logic and reasoning predates even modern science and includes fields as diverse as history, political science, economics, sociology, and pretty much all the areas of knowledge that universities and other institutions deal with. Not only they, but all of us use this logic all the time in our lives, as I will show. We had to, because we could not survive otherwise. But many of us just don't realize that we are doing so. To begin with, let me point out that everything that we can conceive, any object that we can conceive, will also have the purely logical possibility of existence. And God is an easy concept to conceive of and likely emerged early in human history. But just because we can conceive it does not imply that God exists, because all of us confidently assert that many things that are logically possible do not exist. We must do so if we are to function at all. For example, the lady in the blue striped blouse. If I tell you that a monster is under your seat and it's going to kill you at any moment, or that the lady on your right is a zombie, it's waiting to feast your brains, or the gentleman in black is a vampire who's just waiting to drink your blood, or that there exists a three-headed, seven-legged cow that speaks fluent Latin, all of us would say, no, they don't exist. Although this is logically possible, we would confidently assert that they do not exist. But how is it that we can be so absolutely confident that so many things do not exist, if we cannot logically prove their non-existence? It is because, whether we are consciously aware of it or not, we use scientific logic to dismiss the existence of many things. This way of thinking has become so ingrained in us that many do not realize that we are using it. But it is what enables us to function and not go through life fearful of all kinds of imaginary things that might attack us at any moment. I will show that the scientific logic that enables our modern world to exist and tells us that logically possible monsters and zombies and vampires and three-headed, seven-legged Latin-speaking cows don't exist is the very same scientific logic that tells us that no gods exist. By contrast, religious people who argue for the existence of God usually use arguments that they almost never use in other contexts. So why do we use scientific logic in all areas of life? Because it is beyond any doubt that science works and provides us with the most reliable and useful knowledge. Almost everything that modern society is built on, and that we take so much for granted, from our smartphones to cars and planes and electricity and spaceflight and modern medicine, is due to scientific knowledge. We sit in planes that fly in the air at high speeds and don't think about it. Thanks to science, we now have vaccines for diphtheria, polio, measles, whooping cough, and other diseases that have saved the lives of millions of people. In the Middle Ages, 1 in 3 children died before the age of 5 from diseases that we can now prevent. It is because of science, not religion, that life expectancy has increased dramatically since then. We are so used to this knowledge being utterly reliable that we don't give a second thought to how amazing it all is. But all of it is the product of scientific knowledge. Religious knowledge, on the other hand, consists of pure opinion and does not provide useful or reliable information. Here's a test. Take all the accumulated scientific knowledge on one hand and all the accumulated religious knowledge on the other hand. If you had to erase the last 500 years of knowledge from one or the other, which one would you choose? The choice should be easy. If you erase scientific knowledge, then you would be living like people did in the Middle Ages, in disease-ridden, backward societies that have none of the amazing features that we now take for granted. If you erased all of religious knowledge, on the other hand, very little would change. You'd be pretty much living in the same place you do now. So why does science work so well? Let me start by pointing out what some might consider weaknesses of scientific knowledge. We know that scientific knowledge is fallible. It can be wrong. It is also provisional. What we believe to be the best knowledge now can change tomorrow in the light of new knowledge. Scientists never claim to have the ultimate truth. Science has not, and likely never will, provide answers to every question. There are always problems and unresolved issues that scholars work on. That is why science is so exciting and constantly challenging, by presenting new puzzles and problems to be addressed. Science also never proves a theory to be true, nor does it prove any theory to be false. Proof is a concept that arises from mathematical logic, and while mathematical proofs are used in science in order to make concrete predictions, it is important to note that they are not used to judge the truth or falsity of scientific theories. So does that mean that scientific knowledge is the same as opinion? There are some who think so. They say things like, evolution is just a theory, like special creation by God, and that the belief that the Earth is 6,000 years old is just as valid as the statement that it is 4.5 billion years old. That is wrong. It is the use of scientific logic to arrive at our knowledge that makes it so powerful and gives us such great confidence in it, despite its seeming weaknesses, and distinguishes it from pure opinion. And what I will show this evening is that using that same scientific logic, we come to the unavoidable conclusion that God does not exist. So what makes up scientific logic? How does science work? Rather than proof, science uses the preponderance of evidence standard to make judgments. Scientists inductively propose theories or explanations or patterns of observations and data, and then deductively test those theories by comparing their predictions with new observations. If they pass the test, that gives us some confidence in those theories. If they don't pass the test, that means that we have a different and new data pattern, and we in turn inductively generate new theories that we again test deductively. The consensus theory that emerges from this process is one that has the preponderance of evidence in support of it. It is important to note that the test results should be reproducible. You could get it again and again if you repeat the experiment, and objective, independent of whoever conducts the test. Results that are obtained only once or are subjective, in that they are experienced by only one person, are not credible as scientific evidence. Science also, a religious person's statement that he had a vision of his God or that he strongly felt in God's presence would not count as scientific evidence for this reason. And because we know that such experiences can and do occur for completely understood non-God reasons. Science also uses sophisticated statistical analyses to determine if any result is a real effect or one due to chance. And we use double-blind tests to eliminate human biases and wishful thinking. A scientific theory also has to be naturalistic. By this I mean there can be no appeals to any supernatural forces. Whenever scientists encounter a surprising phenomenon in a lab, they do not throw up their hands and say, "I give up, I am baffled, God must have done it." It never happens in the scientific community. Religious people sometimes claim that this shows closed-mindedness on the part of scientists. If so, they should thank their God that scientists are so closed-minded, because it is thanks to that stubborn perseverance that we have any modern science at all. For example, all the modern medicines that have cured so many diseases were arrived at after decades, even centuries of dogged efforts by scientists who refuse to take the easy way out by invoking God. Another feature of scientific knowledge is that the theories they construct in any field interlock with theories in other fields and require overall consistency with them. Scientists spend an enormous amount of time reconciling new theories in one area with other theories that overlap with them, because obtaining that overall consistency is crucial. This is often not understood by religious people who think that they can simply pluck out this or that theory they dislike because it conflicts with their religious beliefs and replace it with their favored one. You can't do that. When religious people say that they reject the theory of evolution and wish to replace just that with some religious theory of creation, or that the earth is just 6,000 years old, or that Adam and Eve and Jonah are historical figures, they are simultaneously rejecting pretty much all of science, because in doing so, they immediately create conflict with other theories of physics, chemistry, biology, geology, and so on. This is why those claims are never taken seriously in the scientific community. Scientific logic is also used to judge where the burden of proof lies in any argument. For example, take existence claims, where you say something exists. Then the burden of proof is on the person making the claim that it exists to provide the preponderance of evidence in favor of it. In the absence of such evidence, the default position is the absence of existence. In other words, the absence of evidence can and is used as evidence of absence. This is how science has ruled out the existence even of things that were formerly thought to exist, like the ether or phlogiston. And this is also precisely why we can confidently say that vampires and zombies and Latin-speaking cows do not exist, even though they cannot be logically ruled out. In the case of universal statements, where you say something is true for everything, the burden of proof shifts to the person challenging the statement. Take the statement that all swans are white. How would someone establish that as a true statement, since they obviously cannot check each and every swan? First of all, the burden of proof is on that person to provide a preponderance of evidence for the existence of even a single white swan. Once that is shown and a few other white swans are found, the universal statement, all swans are white, is taken as presumptively true. The burden of proof then shifts to those denying that statement, who have to provide a preponderance of evidence that at least one non-white swan exists. This is the kind of reasoning that enables scientists, for example, to assert that all electrons in the universe, in the entire universe, are the same. Though obviously we haven't tested each and every electron whether it's true. But that kind of logic is what we used in science. So let's apply scientific logic to existence claims for God. Saying that a God exists is an existence claim, And so the burden of proof is on the person asserting it to provide a preponderance of evidence that their God exists. If they cannot, then scientific logic, the same logic that we use in almost every other aspect of our lives, demands that we conclude that gods do not exist. But arguments in favor of God use almost none of the logic or methods that make science work so well. They do not provide a preponderance of evidence of existence. They do not seek objective, reproducible, and empirical data. They do not use statistical analysis and double-blind tests. They do not seek consistency with other areas of knowledge. What religions do is take some observed phenomenon and explain it with some variation of God did it, phrased with different levels of sophistication. That deductive part of the cycle that makes predictions to compare with reproducible and objective data is completely missing. They do not say things like, if my particular God exists, then we should be able to see evidence for her by looking here and seeing if this happens. It is important to realize also that you cannot back your way into an existence claim. Some religious people spend an enormous amount of effort poking holes in particular scientific theories, such as evolution or cosmology, thinking that if they succeed, the only alternative theory is that God did it. This is futile because it runs against something that has been firmly established for centuries, and that there are an infinite number of theories that can be constructed to encompass any set of data, however large. So if you show that the theory of evolution is false, the only thing you get is that the theory of evolution is false. You have not proved any other theory, God or otherwise, to be true. That has to be shown affirmatively. So existence claims require affirmative evidence in favor of them, not negative ones against rivals. In the absence of that, non-existence is taken to be true. In order to get around the fact that scientific logic demands that we conclude that gods do not exist, religious people try to use philosophical or mathematical logic to convince people of the existence of their gods. But we cannot prove the existence of any being this way because, as David Hume pointed out a long time ago, the absence of a conceived entity never leads to a logical contradiction. So the existence of a God, like the existence of any other entity, can never be shown to be a purely logical truth. This means it must be shown to be a scientific truth, using scientific logic and empirical tests, because only that arrives at truths about the existence or non-existence of something. So the challenge for believers is clear. Logical arguments are not going to do the job. Poking holes in scientific theories that conflict with religious beliefs will not do the job either. They have to provide a preponderance of evidence in favor of God's existence. If they cannot, then scientific logic, the same logic that has revolutionized our lives and that we use every day in every aspect of our lives, demands that we conclude that gods do not exist and that belief in it is merely an opinion. When Joe presents his case for God, listen carefully to see if he uses the preponderance of evidence point. The lack of a preponderance of evidence, affirmative evidence, and the nature of the arguments for God often just serve to highlight the fact that it is just an opinion. In science, when we have a big unresolved issue that needs to be settled, what do? We call a conference of all the figures working in the field to see if any one theory has a preponderance of evidence. If not, they decide on tests to distinguish between the various theories and carry out those tests. Over time, a preponderance of evidence leads to a consensus around one theory, and that becomes accepted as the solution. Contrast this with what happens in religion. Have you ever wondered why we don't have conferences with the leading figures from all the religions getting together to decide which is the one true religion and which of Jesus or Yahweh or Krishna or Allah or the gods of Sikhism and Baha'ism and Shintoism or the thousands of other gods is the one true God? We don't have those conferences, do we? Why is it not even a research topic, with people looking for data that will settle it one way or the other, the way we do with other major unresolved questions? Thank you. The lack of such attempts is for the same reason people don't have conferences to decide the best rock song or the best painting, because those things are pure opinion, and conferences on those topics would be a waste of time. Unfortunately, when religions do try to resolve the question of which religion is the best or the truest, they do so by killing each other. which, as we can see from the many religious wars in the past and the present. There is nothing wrong with having opinions. Opinions can be a lot of fun because you can argue about them endlessly. What is the worst film? Which ice cream flavor is the tastiest? Who is the most annoying celebrity? Justin Bieber or Lindsay Lohan? These are great topics to discuss, but you'll never arrive at any concrete answer. In fact, when you have disagreements that go on for a long time without any serious attempt to resolve them by any objective means, that usually means that the issue being discussed is one of pure opinion. And religion fits that description. So let me conclude. Unlike religion, science produces reliable and useful knowledge. Scientific knowledge is the basis of our modern society. This is because science works. Science works because it uses scientific logic. And using that same scientific logic leads us to conclude that gods do not exist. Thank you.
Well, good evening. I first of all want to offer genuine appreciation to Professor Singham, who has graciously accepted the invitation to come here to be a part of this conversation. We're so grateful for him, and also for his part in opening up this debate with a very stimulating conversation and presentation. I appreciate his work and efforts in doing that. I also want to thank the Northwest Church for hosting this event, and I appreciate you so much for doing that. Also want to thank all of you who are here and who will be listening online. You know, we are here tonight to consider the question of whether or not God exists. Of course, as for my part, I think it's a cosmic wonder that anything should exist at all. I mean, why should there be human beings to live in such a mysterious universe? And why should there even be such a finely tuned universe that allows for human beings to live in it in the first place? It seems to me that the very notion of a universe that might never have been cries out that something or someone serves as the eternally solid foundation upon which everything else stands. Now, obviously, not everyone agrees with that. Thus, the debate tonight. The French philosopher and atheist Albert Camus once held that human beings have a natural urge to find out why we live in such a splendid world. But unfortunately, he also believed that we live in an absurd existence that could never offer us an answer to that fundamental question. But I'm here because I do not find that view intellectually compelling nor personally satisfying. But how could I go about doing this? You know, G.K. Chesterton was once a man who said that a man who believes something because he has some evidence for it or some proof of it is only partially convinced of it. But the man who is entirely convinced thinks everything proves it. Well, I think if that's true, that I guess I'm one of those people that think everything proves it. Something tells me that we don't have time tonight to talk about everything, Professor Singham. And so the difficulty is in knowing where to begin. And so, in light of that, I offer these few suggestions for you to consider. Rather considered in their totality, I'd like to make a cumulative case for the existence of God. And these, as a case, a total case, convinces me that it is vastly more probable that God does in fact exist than that he does not exist. First, I want to argue that the existence of God makes better sense of the origin and or existence of the universe than does atheism. We could think of it this way. If the universe had a beginning at some point in the past, there must have been some cause for its existence, so for its beginning. Since, after all, everything that has a beginning has a cause. Well, it seems obvious to me that the universe could not have created itself out of literally nothing. Now, one might think of the actress Julie Andrews, who sang in The Sound of Music, "Nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could." Should make a great philosopher, I'm sure. Since it seems that the universe had a beginning, then someone or something outside the limits of the universe, like God, must have created it. Now, make no mistake, science has not proven God could not have created our universe. For instance, atheist Dr. Alan Lightman, again an atheist who's a physics professor at MIT, wrote in his book, Accidental Universe, he says, "I am impatient with people who try to disprove the existence of God with scientific evidence. Science can never prove nor disprove the existence of God." Furthermore, all indications point to the idea that the universe did have a beginning. For example, we could talk about the scientific second law of thermodynamics, which simply says that it's the idea that the universe is aging. But if something is aging, there must have been a time when it was once fully young and thus had a beginning at some point. We could talk about the Big Bang cosmology, suggesting a beginning of the universe. Some debates about what takes place before Planck time. That's another discussion for another time, but that suggests, in many people's view, a beginning of the universe. Or the traditional problem of the infinite regress of temporal moments, which logically demonstrates a beginning to the temporal universe, etc., etc., etc. But don't take my word for it. I'm not a physicist. In fact, not a few modern physicists who are atheists hold that there was a beginning to this universe. For example, physics professor at Tufts University, atheist Dr. Alexander Vilenkin, says this, quote, "With the new proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There can be no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." But let's say, just for the sake of argument tonight, that we grant an eternal universe, that there is no beginning. What does that mean or prove about God's non-existence? I still say nothing at all. I suggest that God, unlike the dependent nature of the universe and even everything in the universe, is a necessary being and qualifies as the most plausible explanation for the existence of either an eternal or created universe. But what are, first, the proposed scientific theories for the beginning, or at least the existence, of the universe available to the atheists? There's things called, we don't have time to get into each one, things called the multiverse theory, inflation, the bouncing universe or oscillating universe, string theory, etc. Yet of all of these scientific theories, they all require some level of non-evidential faith. But again, don't take my word for it. I'm not a physicist, so let's listen to some physicists who are atheists saying similar things. In fact, again, consider the atheist physicist Dr. Alan Lightman, again, when he says concerning the multiverse theory, he says, "In addition, we must believe in the existence of many universes, but we have no conceivable way of observing these other universes and cannot prove their existence. Thus, to explain what we see in the world and in our mental deductions, we must believe in what we cannot prove." End quote. The very well-respected quantum physicist, Dr. Alan Guth, who's also an atheist, was interviewed about the origins of the universe in the Discover magazine, 2002 April edition. When he was asked where the universe came from, he first said it came from nothing. When pressed, he admitted that for a quantum physicist, nothing is in fact something. Oh. And that this something was a quantum vacuum. We're supposed to think atheists don't believe in miracles. But then, When asked where the quantum vacuum came from, Dr. Guth explained that it must get its origin from the laws of physics, so there's a prior explanation. But when, in the interview, when he was even pressed further to find out where the laws of physics come from, this was his response, profoundly. We're a long way from being able to answer that one. Atheist physicist Dr. Lawrence Krauss, in a debate with William Lane Craig, mentioned that all the current theories of science concerning how the universe began, including the oscillating universe, multiverse, quantum fluctuation, etc., all of them, he said, again, atheist physicist, all of them have flaws because none of them offer a true theory of quantum gravity. All of them are probably wrong. So really the question tonight that we must ask is this: which belief system offers the best explanation for the existing universe we live in? When I asked Professor Singham if there is an explanation for the origin of the universe or the evolution of life, he said in essence to both questions, and you have them in your papers, but he says it is a question being researched with scientists exploring several possibilities. That's fair enough. But in rejecting God as a viable possibility, Professor Singham seems to be guilty of the science of the gaps fallacy. This fallacy is a fallacy that holds that whenever a scientist doesn't know an answer to some mystery in nature, they immediately assume that a scientific solution will be forthcoming. So he biases himself against the possibility of God creating the universe or existing to intervene in the universe, even when there's absolutely no evidence to do so. Professor Singham talks about evidence and the preponderance of evidence. I would like to consider that further. But even if we grant something like the string theory or an eternal multiverse as a brute scientific fact, which again, I'm not suggesting or proposing either one of those, but just for the sake, perhaps we just grant that they're brute scientific facts. What, again, would that say about the non-existence of God? Again, I say nothing. Any scientific theory still needs to answer the more fundamental question: why should anything exist instead of nothing? Why is the universe here? We can talk about all day about the how and the mechanisms of the things, how things work, and all sorts of theories about origins or whatever, but the ultimate question really is why? Not how, but why should anything arise or exist in the first place? You see, dependent beings like you and I and things in this universe do not offer a sufficient explanation for their own existence. I needed my mom and dad. I'm dependent on a lot of things for my existence. Therefore, a necessary being would possess the greatest explanatory power for the existence of dependent things like a universe or universes. Therefore, a necessary being like God serves as the best explanation for either the created or the eternal, or existence at least, of the universe. And as a necessary being, by definition, God would need no comparable cause or explanation for his. Second, the existence of God better explains the existence of objective morality than does atheism. One of the pre-debate questions I asked Professor Singham, and you have it again in your hands, is whether or not he believes in absolute morality or objective morality. He responded by saying, quote, "If by objective you mean existing independently of us, then the answer is no. If by objective you mean something that is not entirely culturally acquired, then there is evidence that evolution has created some primal moral impulses." Well, I find it a cold and unenviable position to be in, to believe that our values come from biological or cultural impulses alone. In saying this, Professor Singham is implying, not believing, he doesn't hold what I'm about to say. I'm not attributing that he holds this view. What I'm suggesting is his view implies these things, irregardless of whether anybody holds them or not. It's the worldview of atheism that I'm addressing. But the view that Professor Singham is implying is that believing we should avoid killing infants, now follow me, killing infants just for fun is no different than saying that we should eat when we're hungry. Why? Because both impulses would come from the same biological mechanisms produced by blind evolution. Analytic philosopher Dr. Mark Linville suggests that there are deep problems with this line of thinking. For instance, evolutionary ethics are descriptive, not prescriptive. Evolution can only tell us what happens, not what ought to happen. On this evolutionary count, the sense of moral obligation is merely an illusion given to us by evolution for mere survival purposes. There is simply no moral authority or basis or grounding with purposeless, unguided evolution. Atheist evolutionists Michael Ruse and E.O. Wilson seem to agree with Professor Singham there when they write, and I quote, "In an important sense, ethics as we understand it is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes in order to get us to cooperate." So Professor Singham's view that morals might answer the question as to why we do follow our biological impulses or cultural standards, but he does not sufficiently address why we ought to follow them. If morality is merely the living out of evolutionary instinct via genetics or culture, as C.S. Lewis once asked, but why ought we to obey instinct? Is there another instinct of higher order directing us to do so? In the end, Lewis's criticism applies to Professor Singham's view that morality makes no distinctions between the words I ought and I itch. As agnostic evolutionist Michael Shermer explains, in his evolutionary theory of morality, asking why should we be moral is kind of like asking why should we be hungry. The answer is that it is as much a part of human nature through the same process of evolution to be moral as it is to be hungry. But to say you ought to be moral is like saying you ought to be hungry. It simply doesn't make any sense. Nobody says they ought to be hungry. They just get hungry. So there seems to be no grounding reason as to why we ought to be moral in any meaningful way. C.S. Lewis again observed that the atheist view of ethics would mean that our fondness for taking care of our children is the same kind of fondness as our fondness for eating cheese. In fact, Professor Singham says in a blog post, commenting about the mass murderers and mental illness patients, he says that our moral senses and all other actions of the brain are inseparable. Now notice, consider, he says, quote, but this, the moral responsibility, assumes a separation between the moral sense and the actions of the brain, but that does not stand up under scrutiny. We all act according to the dictates of our brains. Our moral sense originates in the brain, too. So why, and here's the important question, why should one set of brain commands be seen as more culpable or responsible than any others? That's a great question. Why should one set of brain commands be seen as more culpable than any others? Professor Singham thinks they shouldn't, or at least in that blog post. So basically, we're just machines doing what our brains are commanding us to do. Thus, a person whose brain commands them to murder someone is no more or less culpable, ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, for their actions than a person whose brain commands them to eat cheese. Again, same biological impulses. Consequently, there are profound problems with this view of human morality. As popular atheist Richard Dawkins says in his book, River Out of Eden, he says this, if life ends at the grave, then it makes no ultimate difference whether you live as Stalin or as a Mother Teresa. Since your destiny is ultimately unrelated to your behavior, you may as well live as you please. As the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky once put it, if there is no immortality, then all things are permitted. Second problem with evolutionary ethics is that they are accidental to history. In other words, if human morality only exists as an accident to human evolutionary history, humans could have evolved any different set of moral impulses. As Charles Darwin wrote in his Descent of Man, if men were reared under precisely the same conditions as beehives, by the way, as beehives, there can be hardly a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. If one could rewind evolutionary history, as Stephen Gould once pointed out, the chances are vastly likely that the outcome of human moral impulses and culture would be very different. Humans, given a beehive type of environment, could just have easily evolved the belief that mothers killing fertile daughters for personal survival was a moral duty. Thus, Professor Singham's view implies really that moral truths do not exist objectively. However, believing in absolute moral values is simply inescapable. We don't need an argument to believe that actions like rape or abusing children for fun is objectively immoral and not just impractical or non-adaptive given our evolutionary history or culture. Thus, it seems a natural and more reasonable conclusion is to say that human beings have inherent moral worth and that objective morality exists beyond mere survival impulses. But to say this, the best explanation is to believe that there is a morally good and personal lawgiver who exists as the ground of all moral goodness. Thus, our common sense view of morality favors the view that God exists and serves as the basis for absolute values in the world. And I don't have time for my next argument, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe, for your comments. And I'd like to start the rebuttal by asking you to observe the structure of Joe's arguments. And that is, there was no affirmative evidence or arguments given for God's existence. What was pointed out was that science does not have the answers to the origins of the universe yet. It does not have answers to the origins of life yet. It raised the questions of morality. It didn't address the issue of consciousness, but those are really the four issues that defenders of God use. They say that because we don't understand these things, therefore God must have done it. And that is that God is the most plausible explanation of this. Or that where did everything come from? Why is there something other than nothing? The only answer to that is God. But as I have pointed out, the answer that something exists is never a negative argument. It's never, you could argue, and I will argue the universe question at the beginning, the fact that the universe has an existence at one point in time is just one of the many theories of the universe. The eternal universe is another model. Eternal inflation is another model. The question of why our particular universe had a low entropy at the beginning is something that people study. But that's not an insurmountable problem. The problem is that we haven't as yet in the scientific community arrived at a convergence on one theory. There are rival theories for which these problems simply go away. But let me begin, before I get to that, by telling you a parable. Since we are in church, that seems appropriate. It comes from the book Physics for the Inquiring Mind by Eric Rogers. And it addresses the question, what is it that brings a rolling ball to a stop? When you roll a ball along the ground, why does it stop? And the debate is between two people, a scientist who argues that it is friction, and a religious person who argues that it is demons that are stopping it. Some of you may be familiar with the stand-up comedian Eddie Izzard, who does some very funny dialogue where he plays both roles looking in opposite directions. I'm going to try that. I'm not Eddie Izzard, so bear with me if it doesn't go that well. Okay. So, scientists, I don't believe in demons. I do. Anyway, I don't see how demons can make friction. They just stand in front of things and push them to stop them from moving. I don't see any demons even on the roughest table. They are too small, even transparent. But there is more friction on rough surfaces. More demons. Oil helps to reduce friction. Oil drowns demons. If I polish the table, there is less friction and the ball rolls further. You are wiping the demons off. There are fewer to push. If I put a rough brick on the table and I push against it, and I push against friction with more and more force, up to a limit, the brick stays still, with friction just balancing my push. Of course, the demons push just hard enough to stop you moving the brick. But there is a limit to their strength, beyond which they collapse and you can move the brick. Friction follows definite laws. For example, experiments show that a brick sliding along a table is dragged by friction with a force independent of velocity. Of course, the same number of demons to crush, however fast you run over them. If I slide a brick along a table again, the friction is the same each time. Demons would be crushed on the first trip. Yes, but they multiply incredibly fast. There are other laws of friction. For example, the drag is proportional to the pressure holding the surfaces together. The demons live in the pores of the surface. More pressure makes more of them rush out and be crushed. Demons act in just the right way to push and drag with the forces you find in your experiments. End of parable. This kind of argument can go on forever. And arguments made for the existence of gods invariably end up like the ones made by the believer in demons. Note that the demons, quote unquote, quote, explain all the facts about friction. Also, the believer can claim that if I just accept the existence of demons, then the theory becomes simple and plausible and even irrefutable. It's an all-encompassing theory that explains everything. It can even be explained to be sort of irrefutable and cannot be contradicted. By contrast, the scientific theory of friction is complicated, involving intermolecular forces that have to be consistent with other theories, and it doesn't explain everything. The trouble with science is that it can't just make stuff up to dismiss any problem. It has to provide evidence, it has to provide arguments, it has to provide consistency. So given this quote-unquote greater explanatory power of demons for friction, why don't we teach the demon theory of friction in science classes? Because it is a useless theory. It only explains things after the fact, by making up reasons as needed. The existence of even a single demon has not been shown with a preponderance of evidence. The theory has absolutely no predictive power and no connection to any other theories. It is a purely ad hoc and post hoc theory. If I am allowed to make up any properties I like to a phenomenon, then I can explain anything at all. It doesn't have to be God. It could be demons, it could be extraterrestrials, it could be Latin-speaking cows. I can use my Latin-speaking cow to explain everything. There is a Latin-speaking cow that created the universe. If I'm not obliged to provide any evidence, anything goes. I want to compare the religious way of explaining things with the way that science does with a major question, such as how our present state of the universe came about. Thousands of years ago, some nomadic tribesmen in the desert looked up at the night sky and wondered where everything came from. And they made up stories about it and said that God had done it. And these stories are what we still find in religious books and what many religious people believe. Now we know better. I'm going to ask to show a video clip that takes what we know from science about what the universe was made of just 12 million years after the Big Bang. And how black holes grow, and then predicts how the universe evolved over 40. It is based on the best theories we have, the evidence that we have, all that combined together to predict what happens. Notice that God, who is supposed to be everywhere, is nowhere in the video. either physically or as a necessary concept. In other words, she is irrelevant. So what are you going to believe, science or the tales of nomadic tribesmen a long time ago? One of the other claims that scientists need faith. And I hear this a lot, that scientists also use faith. But there is a difference between the faith of scientists and the faith of religious believers. The thing is, science, as I said, never proves anything to be true. But we act with confidence that they will hold. For example, if I drop an object, it will fall. If I release my phone, it will fall. If I do it again, it will fall. If I do it 99 times, it will fall 99 times. I cannot prove that it will fall the 100th time I drop it. Scientist has no way of proving that what will happen the 100th time is the same as what will happen the previous 99 times. But we have faith that it will, because we have faith in the laws of physics, because it produces reliable and useful knowledge. The faith of a scientist is to cross that tiny bridge between 99.9% confidence and certainty. We cannot reach certainty, so if we use faith, that's how scientists use the word faith, to bridge that tiny gap. Whereas with religion, faith is a vast gap. A scientist, the faith of a scientist a religious person is in opposition to evidence. When there is no evidence at all, you are expected to believe this huge thing. You are expected to believe that God exists and created this whole universe without any evidence in support of it. So the word faith is used by religious people quite differently from the way that scientists use faith. With science, faith is, for example, the Higgs boson that was discovered and for which the Nobel Prize was given, was found by scientists who, after weighing all the evidence, said there is a 99.9994% chance that it is accurate and not a mistake. So that we don't have 100%, but we have faith that that is true. The morality. I never understand the argument about morality, that it's universal. If you look at the Bible, the morality is awful. Disobedient or rude children, stone them to death. Blasphemers, stone to death. Someone working on the Sabbath, stone them to death. Adulterers, stone to death. Woman not a virgin on a wedding night, stone her to death. How can this be a universal moral standard? Everything we know about morality suggests that it has evolved over time culturally. We have some primal moral impulses, but culturally we have added to those, and we are far more moral now than in biblical times. Even Jesus said that he is not there to break the law of the prophet, but to fulfill them, and he supported those very same laws. Scientists are human, and they can fall into the same beliefs as others in wanting to believe what they want to believe. This is why we have all the precautions in science to prevent that. The existence of God, cannot, like the existence of any other entity, is an empirical question that requires an empirical answer and can never be shown to be a purely logical truth. All the things that Joe mentioned are just saying that there are these unresolved questions, therefore God is the answer. That is not how we arrive at really reliable knowledge. I think that everyone will concede that the existence of gods, like ghosts or witches or vampires or zombies, is not manifestly true, in that we have no direct evidence that he exists. The best arguments for religious people only take you as far as the mere possibility of an invisible God. But as Delos McCown said, the invisible and the non-existent look very much alike. Unless believers in God produce a preponderance of evidence and repeatable and objective evidence that God exists, we have to treat the claim that God exists in the same way that we treat claims for the existence of other things that are invisible and undetectable, like the ether or phlogiston or three-headed, seven-legged Latin-speaking cows, and conclude that it does not exist. You cannot back into an existence claim for God by simply pointing out unanswered questions that science has not addressed. Because as I said before, science always has unanswered questions. And that's why we need affirmative evidence. Thank you.
of all, he mentioned, I thought a little bit of an interesting statement, is that he said that it was nowhere in that video that God was in that video. I just wonder if God was even introduced or invited to come to that video. Aside from that, he said that there are no arguments, that religion is based on irrationality. Well, that's simply not the case, and in fact, I might suggest that I presented 2 arguments for the existence of God, in which he made a couple of assertions about it, but I didn't hear, for as far as I could see, I didn't hear any argument that would have shown that the arguments that I presented would have in any way been served as a defeater for that argument. I didn't see any proofs against that argument, so I don't think those arguments were addressed at all, just sort of some assertions to the contrary. Also, he mentions, for instance, that toward the end of his original speech, he said at the end there, he made a quick statement, though, that I think is important. He said, we're being more moral now as a people than it ever used to be. Presumably because, as I understand, that he's seeing the cultural trends to become more secular. And so, we're far more moral now than we ever used to be. Well, considering the fact that Professor Singham says that there's no such thing as absolute morals, I wonder how in the world we could be more moral than we used to be, if there's no set of standards by which we can judge what's moral, what's not, outside of mere impulses. Also, consider this. Is religion really evil? He says the wars that's provided by or was caused by religions. In fact, he made the same argument in a YouTube video that's entitled, Why is Atheism Winning? A very, very similar argument and statement that he made at the end there. It says that religion is evil. In fact, I quote, he says, religion, in the video, serves as the power base for the nutters and the extremists. End quote. Well, my question is, and certainly we can list a whole bunch of evils done by religious people, but does atheism or even secularism fare any better? I think could it be argued that secularism or atheism would serve as a power base of secular extremists? For example, Stalin, prior to, of course, there's also Pol Pot and Mao Zedong, Mussolini, Jeffrey Dahmer, Lenin, Hitler. Now, I know Hitler, some people say, well, he wasn't an atheist, and we won't get into the historical part about that, but I think pretty much the historians are pretty much in consensus that whether he was a nominalist Catholic or not, he was not a Catholic, a devout Catholic. He did things out of his secular agenda and movement. And so he was more motivated by social Darwinism than anything religious. Well, all of these, Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, Mussolini, Jeffrey Dahmer, Stalin, Hitler, Lenin, and many, many others, that's in the 21st century. In the 20th and 21st century, we can take a look at these and say, has morality really improved? Well, let's take a look. As Dr. David Berlinski says, just who imposed upon the suffering human race high explosives, barbed wire, poison gas, experiments in eugenics, napalm, the atomic submarine, and nuclear weapons. If memory serves me, it was not the Vatican. In fact, during the 20th century, World War I, there was 15 million people killed. Russian Civil War, 9 million. Stalin's Russian regime, 20 million. World War II, 55 million. Chinese Civil War, 2.5 million. Mao Zedong's regime, 40 million. And the list could go on and on. And these were wars and conflicts not motivated by religion, but secularist causes. Now, should we argue that secularism, atheism, being part of that, serves as the power base for atheist extremists? I'm not prepared to argue it that way. Listen, I don't blame atheists for the evil that specific atheists have done, so I kind of wish that the new atheists would quit blaming all religion for the evil that certain religious people have done. If we ever plan on exercising charitable conversations, we need to get past these kinds of new atheist accusations and tactics. Truth is, we want to get past that, and I'm certainly not wanting to engage in that sort of reasoning and accusing people to do anything. In fact, consider this. Religion has served as a powerful, powerful force for good and love in the world. We need to consider and remember that it is the religious people who are the ones who have produced more hospitals, have built children's homes throughout the world, and have fed massive numbers of starving children and families worldwide. In fact, I argue Christianity, rather than serving as the basis of extremism, actually serves as the power base of love, charity in the world, not extremism again. He mentioned that, again, there was no arguments presented or no rational arguments presented other than just showing that God is plausible or whatever. But the fact is there are many, many more arguments I could have presented. For instance, design implies a designer. If there is design, therefore there is a designer. I don't have time to develop this, but just take a look at outside and you'll find the amazing miracles of nature. In fact, the more you look at the universe, the more intelligence you will find in it. One single cell, for instance, has even enough information to fill 80,000 books. And if all the DNA in the human body was stretched out and tied together, it would reach the sun and back, which is 92 million miles apart, not once, but 70 times. That amount of information is just astronomical. And what does that have anything to do with anything? We need to remember the movie. I don't know if you've ever watched that movie, Contact with Jodie Foster. Carl Sagan and all the people Carl Sagan wrote that story, and he says, and in this book, there was a group of scientists who were trying to discover life beyond Earth. Well, how did they do this? By one simple method. They were listening for signals from space that showed evidence. Not just order, but information. Because if they discovered information from space, then they knew they had discovered intelligent life that served as the source of information. Why? Because quite naturally we know that where there is information, there is intelligence behind it. So, he says religion is actually against evidence. I'm trying to present evidence. But having said that, there's a lot of things that we believe, and scientists as well. We're not, and he's really about, and he noticed a few times he talks about empirical evidence, as if that's the only way we can prove something. But consider if we adopt that method, in the court system, for instance. If we adopt that method, you can only prove something by empirical data. Well, consider if somebody comes to a criminal scene and a crime was committed, but the criminal isn't there, they can still find the criminal and still put him on trial and find him guilty. How? When they haven't seen the crime. Because they look at the effects of nature. They look at the effects around them. They look at evidences such as fingerprints and various other things. And so there is an empirical observation within that, even though they don't see the criminal do the crime. I'm suggesting to you that whether it's the design argument or the argument from creation or the argument from morality, I'm suggesting that all of these things show us divine fingerprints all over the world. We have proof. We have evidence. We need to consider not just the empirical, visible world that we live in. I don't know how I could empirically prove that my wife loves me. I don't know how I could prove that. Through empirical data alone. Just because somebody holds somebody's hand or kisses them or makes dinner. There are people doing that all around the country, all around the world doing that, but they go through the motions, but they don't truly love the person. How would you prove empirically that your wife loves you or your husband loves you? We are human beings. that are more than just empirical creations, empirical things. We're more than just machines operating by certain observable patterns of evidence that we prove deductively. We're also artistic human beings. Poetry, love, goodness. All of these things exist in the world and point directly to a loving being who is a personal being, who in fact does exist and gives us that very sense of love and compassion as well. He talks about morality. Oh, and also talks about that science doesn't really have no need for God, sort of pushes God out in so many words. That's simply not the case. Physicist Dr. Lawrence Krauss, who's an atheist, he says this in his book. He says they could be the laws of nature could be almost anything. The universe is far stronger and far more richer, more wonderfully strange than our wildest imaginations can anticipate. Modern cosmology has driven us to consider ideas that could not have been formulated a century ago. I have a few questions then for Dr. Krauss. If the laws of nature could almost be anything, then can it be possible that the laws of nature be of such a sort to allow miracles? If it could be almost anything. Dr. Krauss admits that we have no idea what the possibilities are with regard to nature. Could it be, then, that these possibilities could include events we sometimes call miracles? If the universe is far stranger than our wildest imaginations, end quote, is it possible that miracles or God's interactive activity in our world could be included in what our wildest imaginations can anticipate? If modern cosmology has driven us to consider ideas that could not have been formulated a century ago, according to Dr. Krauss, is it possible that they will drive us to consider ideas, including the possibility of miracles, in the upcoming century? The idea here isn't the God of the gaps. I'm not saying science doesn't have an answer, therefore God. What I'm saying is more of a positive argument than that. What I'm saying is, as Professor Singham seems to suggest, is science to sort of push God out as a need for explanation. Science simply has not done so. Thank you. I do want to consider about two additional clues that I believe strongly point us in the direction of God's existence. These are, first of all, the existence of beauty in the world, and number two, the reality of ultimate meaning in life. Consider first that the existence of God is the only reasonable answer to the universal human need for ultimate meaning and purpose to life. When I asked Professor Singham if there is any ultimate meaning in life, he said, and I quote, "But if by ultimate meaning you mean something that exists independently of us, then the answer is no. We find meaning by creating it ourselves individually and collectively." But consider this argument. Something has meaning if and only if a personal agent or group of agents endows it with meaning. Number two, there is a personal agent that endows all human life with ultimate meaning. Therefore, all human life has been endowed with ultimate meaning. Now, Professor Singham and I seems to be in agreement with the first premise, but not the last two. The area, though, it seems to me, is the biggest disagreement seems to be who the personal agent is that endows life with meaning. Professor Singham says that life is endowed with meaning only by human persons creating it for themselves. But this idea carries with it two unavoidable implications. Number one, it would mean that no human act or decision could have any intrinsic value or meaning to it at all. It would mean that stomping on a baby's, by the way, I know Mano Singham does not believe this, that's not what I'm suggesting, but it would imply that stomping on a baby's head for fun would be no less intrinsically, maybe creatively meaning, but not intrinsically meaningful than stepping on an anthill. It would mean that one person's created meaning would be no more or less valuable than another person's created personal meaning. If millionaire Bob decided that the meaning of his life for him would to eat Cheetos and play video games all day, every day, then his meaning to life would be just as meaningful as millionaire Susan's decision to give her life to helping orphans and feeding the hungry around the world. There simply would be no value distinctions between their choices of meaning beyond mere opinion, culture, or individual. But assuming that we're able to think properly, we all know, all of us know, I'm sure, that a baby's life is inherently more meaningful than an anthill. And we all know that Susan's cause is much more meaningful than Bob's. Thus, no one, so it seems to me, ought to believe the view that there is no objective meaning to human existence apart from our own arbitrary creations, whether collectively or individually. Now, I'm not saying again that Professor Singham believes these implications. What I'm saying is his atheistic view of life's meaninglessness implies them just the same. It's my view, though, that human beings are made in the image of God, and that God is the person that endows ultimate and eternal meaning to our lives, and that this makes better sense of humanity's inescapable convictions about life's meaning. Consider second, though, that the existence of the divine artist makes better sense of the artistic beauty found in the universe than the accidental blind forces behind or implied by atheism. When we look out at the world, we see amazing beauty such that it appears artistically crafted. But beautiful art suggests a beautiful artist, or a gifted artist. Therefore, it seems to me that a gifted artist appears to have painted, so to speak, on the canvas of the cosmos, thus artistically crafting the world we live in. Go into any art gallery, and you see a beautiful painting of the world on the wall. Now, you know intuitively that a gifted and talented painter put it there. Everybody agrees with that, but if that were true, why would we think any differently about the real thing? I agree with Camille Paglia, who is herself an atheist, but yet worries about what a world would look like without belief in God, when she says, quote, "But a totally secularized society with contempt for religion sinks into materialism and self-absorption and gradually goes slack without leaving an artistic legacy. Without God, there is no art, no beauty, no morals, no meaning. But that is not the kind of world we find ourselves in. There is art, beauty, meaning, and morals just because there is a God who is the very ground of all being, the very basis of all that is, and the very inspiration of the creation of all things beautiful. Thus, the preponderance of evidence lies highly in favor of the belief that God exists and hardly supports the proposition tonight that God does not exist. But in fact, so I argue, when all clues considered together, makes that proposition simply unreasonable." Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Let me begin by addressing some points. This idea that without God you can't have truth and beauty and awe and wonder and love, and I just don't understand that. Why is God necessary for any of those things? I showed you the video of the universe. When I see that, I think we just live in a tiny speck of the universe. For a tiny time, humans have been here. And yet we have been able to figure out the history of our universe over 14 billion years. It fills me with wonder and pleasure. The fact that science has explained it does not take away from that wonder, it makes it even greater. We now understand so many things. When I listen to a Beethoven symphony, the fact that I know how sound works and the vibrations and how my ear generates that in my brain and how my brain processes it, does not take away from the beauty of the music, it enhances it. Joe says he's not arguing a God of the gaps, but it is entirely a God of the gaps. He points to things and says, how could this have happened? How could it be so beautiful? How could the universe be so wonderful without a God? No. If you are saying God exists, you have to provide evidence for God. You can't simply say, we don't understand this. Right now, religious people used 4 things: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, morality, and consciousness, to argue that without God, we can't explain those things. No. Those things used to be mysteries in that we were puzzled. Now they become puzzles. Scientists are working on all these areas, and we are making great strides, and you can be sure that we will get there. As to without God, we would be killing babies. It is the Bible that argues that you should stone your own children to death if they just talk back at you. It's not atheists who are saying it, it's the Bible that says it. So where is this universal morality that says that? As to being more violent, Steven Pinker wrote a book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he argues that yes, the 20th century was a violent time, but if you look at the data over all history, the 20th century was also more populous, that we have less probability of being killed now than ever in the history of the universe. The past is very violent, but we forget all those violent things that happened before because they were far long ago. In my final remarks, I want you to appeal to all of you to join me in that wonderful world that opens up when you shed the prison of religious thought and enter the open spaces of science. I know that taking that step is not easy for a religious person because believers have been frightened with images of hell and torment. To think even for a moment that God does not exist may make people feel guilty and frightened because they have been taught that God can read their minds and that He may punish them even for their thoughts. I am here to encourage you to break free of those. There is no hell. There is no God. Okay? And there are many like me, and the numbers are increasing, who have shed this kind of thinking. I urge you to take that same step, and you will find many people who will help you along that new journey of freedom. This may surprise you, but I used to be very religious myself. I was an ordained lay minister of my church. I remember that as trying to reconcile science with religion became harder and harder to do, I at one point tentatively asked myself the question in a very frightened way, what if there is no God? Suddenly, everything made sense, and I felt as if a huge weight had been lifted off me and that I was free. That feeling was exhilarating. Suddenly the world made sense to me.
Without trying to fit God into it. I know that I am not alone. When I talk to other former believers, they tell very similar stories. Robert Ingersoll put it well. He said, when I became convinced that the universe is natural, that all the ghosts and gods are myths, they are entered into my brain, into my soul, into every drop of my blood, the sense, the feeling, the joy of freedom. The walls of my prison crumbled and fell. The dungeon was flooded with light, and all the bolts and bars and manacles became dust. What I am telling you is that the key to opening that door, the prison door, is to get rid of all those ideas and beliefs that come out of the old religious books and which imprison people, and step outside. The outside world is amazing, and you too can experience the thrill of discovering the wonders of the universe by becoming free from the burdens of religious dogma. Bertrand Russell said it well. Even if the open windows of science at first make us shiver, after the cozy indoor warmth of traditional humanizing myths, in the end, the fresh air brings vigor, and the great spaces have a splendor of their own. So I urge you to join me in that exploring that great world that exists outside, the world of science and reliable knowledge. Thank you.